How to bind a quilt. When it comes to finishing the edges of a quilt, many quilters are lost. Don't let mitered corners and binding scare you. Instructions: Step 1. Fold the binding over the edge of your quilt and pin it to the back. Quick tip: when you reach a corner, sew to the diagonally folded tab, and then backstitch. Start on the other side of the folded tab and continue around the quilt. Step 2. Stitch the binding into place with a needle and thread every 1/2 inch. Make sure to catch the binding, back, and batting with the thread, but not the front of the quilt. Step 3. Stitch down the diagonal fold in the corners to create a mitered corner to finish your quilt. Did you know? A Civil War era quilt known as the Reconciliation Quilt is the most expensive quilt ever sold, for $264,000 at an auction in 1991. Step 4. Sew the binding into place all the way around your quilt. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and remove pins as you sew. Step 5. Unfold an area large enough to sew the two ends of the binding together, trim excess, and pin back into place. Step 6. Lay the binding on top of the quilt with the raw edges together, beginning at least 1 foot from a corner, and pin it in place. Step 7. Sew the strips of fabric end to end using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Fold this binding in half lengthwise with the wrong sides of the fabric together, and then iron it flat. Quick tip: keep the seams of the binding at least 1 inch from any corner to create proper mitered corners. Step 8. Fold the binding in a perpendicular direction to the side you pinned at each corner, and then fold it back. Line up the edges of the folded corner and pin it in place. Step 9. Pin the lengths of each side and corner into place until the ends of your binding meet. Trim any excess fabric at the end, leaving a 1/2 inch tail for a seam allowance. Step 10. Cut the accent fabric into 2 1/2 inch wide strips. There should be enough strips that, when sewn end to end, they can cover the perimeter of your quilt, plus 4 to 6 inches for seam allowance.